Briefly, I want to give his background. Born in New York City, Dr. Robert Hewsen received his doctorate from Georgetown University, where he studied Armenian and Caucasian history under the late pioneer Armenist Kirill Tumanov. From 1967 to 1999, he taught Russian Byzantine history at Rowan University, Glassboro, New Jersey, where he is now Professor Emeritus. In addition, he has taught Armenian history as a visiting professor at the Universities of Michigan, Pennsylvania 4 times, Chicago 3 times, Tübingen, Germany twice, Columbia twice, St. Nurses Seminary, California State University, Fresno, the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and four at the Armenian Relief Society's summer sessions in Armenian culture, 6 summers. He has lectured at Harvard, Princeton, Berkeley, Dumbarton Oaks, the Pierpont Morgan Library in New York, the Armenian Library and Museum of America, and at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. He participates regularly in Armenian studies panels at the annual Middle East Studies Association, MESA conferences. Besides numerous articles and book reviews in scholarly journals, Dr. Hewsen has published an English translation of the 7th century Armenian geography. He has also contributed 8 maps of Armenia to the Tübingen Atlas of the Middle East. Has published through the University of Chicago Press a 336-page, 278-map historical atlas of Armenia, and the book is right in here, and I have to say that's my Bible in this museum. If anyone walks in and asks me about a village, I know where to go. I know Dr. Hewsen's atlas will tell me where that person's village is. I'm sorry, I lost my note. Currently, he is publishing a book with Karen Ketenjian, a well-known Armenian attorney in Fresno. It just completed the translation of an unpublished Armenian manuscript that he found in the library of the University of Tübingen. Professor Hewsen has visited Armenia 7 times since 1961 and Eastern Anatolia twice, 1998, 1999. In April 2000, he toured Syria, Lebanon, and Cyprus, and the following October traveled through Highland Karabakh. In 2002, Dr. and Mrs. Hewsen settled in Fresno, California, where they now make their home. So with no further overdue, Dr. Hewsen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mrs. Gershon, Maggie, for that kind introduction. Can you hear me all? Am I right here on this? Okay. How about now? All right.
Bring it closer to you.
Across the better? Oh, that close. Oh, okay, okay, right, all right. I think you can hear me now.
Yes,
Certainly. All right. I'm very grateful to be invited here to speak for the 2nd time, and I want to thank Maggie for making it possible. I also want to thank John and Barbara for driving me down. I really appreciate that. And tomorrow they're going to be taking me over to Glendale so I can buy some Armenian books, which is something I usually do when I come down through the Los Angeles area. I'm going to be talking about the Mekhitarist contribution to the Armenian Renaissance. It's a broad subject, and I'm not going to go into too much depth on it. There won't be time. But it's a subject that I'm very close to. I've been to the Mekhitarists more than once. They've helped me in my work, and I appreciate what they've done for me and for the Armenian people. Between 1717, when Mekhitar of Sepastia first arrived in Venice with 17 followers, and the year 1816, when the Lazarian College was founded in Moscow, the Mekhitarist order, which Mekhitar had established, was the only major center of Armenian culture that the Armenian people possessed. I'd often thought that was perhaps a bit of an exaggeration, but I've had apostolic Armenians tell me the same thing. Having converted to Catholicism himself in 1694, Father Mekhitar devoted his life to the uplift of the Armenian people, who had been living for centuries under oppressive Muslim rule. He was not a nationalist. He had no political agenda, although there were Armenians in his day who did indeed have a political agenda and were working for the liberation of the Armenian people, he was of another stripe. He was more of a patriot, a very sincere patriot, who devoted himself to the spiritual and the educational uplift of the Armenian people. Is very much so a patriot. Before describing the achievements of Mekhitar and the order he founded, I would like to put him in a broader context. Mekhitar did not spring forth in a vacuum. His appearance at that time in that place was part of a continuing process that actually began with the conversion of Armenia to Christianity in the early 4th century. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about Armenian Catholicism, which I found surprisingly few Armenians know too much about. If we define a Roman Catholic as one who accepts the Pope as the head of the Universal Church, then there have been Armenian Catholics since the conversion of Armenia in the early 4th century. It is a account of this seminal event in Armenian history. Agatangos, whoever he may have been and whenever he may have written, asserts that after his conversion to the new faith, King Turdad journeyed westward to confer with the Emperor Constantine, the first Christian Roman emperor, and went on to Rome to visit Pope Sylvester as well. Now this was Turdad and St. Gregory together. The story is fictitious. No Western writer, not even the biographer of Constantine, mentions any such visit to Rome by an Eastern potentate. The very fact that the story was concocted at all, however, makes it clear that the significance of the Pope was recognized by the Armenians not only in the time of St. Gregory, when the pilgrimage to Rome is supposed to have taken place, but also in the latter part of the 5th century, when Agatangos most probably wrote. Armenian bishops, we know, took part in the first 3 ecumenical councils, the Council of Nicaea, the Council of Constantinople, the Council of Ephesus. Armenian bishops were present at all of them, along with the delegations from the Pope. All this, however, came to an end in the 6th, 7th centuries, when a series of events and decisions led to the separation between the Armenian Church and the mainstream of Christianity at that time. Even then, however, the separation did not affect the Armenians living across the border in the Byzantine Empire, which at that time owned at least a quarter of Armenia and continued to do so until the coming of the Turks to Anatolia in 1071. The Byzantines required anyone living in their empire to accept their church, and that church was in affiliation with Rome, the Roman Catholic Church, until 1054. In the 11th century, the arrival of the Crusaders brought the Armenians of Cilicia into direct contact with the Catholic Church. And for nearly 300 years, about 1080 to 1375, there were tentatives towards union with Rome on the part of the various Catholicoi and kings of the Armenian land in Cilicia. The high point of this flirtation, we might call it, occurred in 1199, when Leo II, Baron of Armenia, and Gregory VI, Catholicos of the Armenian Church, accepted union with Rome. Leo was then crowned King Leo I of Armenia in the Cathedral of Tarsus by both the Catholicos and by the Cardinal Wittelsbach, the legate, the ambassador of Pope Celestine III. This union didn't last, but the Catholic Church had its foot in the door. And in the mid-14th century, the Vatican dispatched a number of Italian Dominican fathers to Armenia as an order called the Unitarian Brothers, Fratres Unitores in Latin. These friars established their seat at the monastery of Kurna, near Nakhichevan, and there began a rather spirited effort to convert the Armenian people to the Catholic faith. You notice the previous attempt at conversion was from the top down, convert the Catholicos and the king, and here they went grassroots to convert the people. Soon as the original Italian friars died and were gradually replaced by native Armenian clergy, there arose some 17 Roman Catholic monasteries in the area of Mekhitarist. And the area was so thoroughly Catholicized that Europeans passing through referred to it as Frank Armenia, that is European Armenia, because the people there were mostly Catholics. We even hear of one Armenian prince who was publicly a Muslim, but in the safety of his castle, he was practicing Christianity, and he was a Catholic. The Spanish ambassador to Persia tells us this. The most important result of this Roman Catholic enterprise was the intellectual stimulus that it gave to the more learned clergymen in Armenia. Chief among them, Grigor Tatavetsi, Gregory of Tatev, who died in 1410. He and his school took up their pens in a spirited defense of the traditional Armenian faith against the Roman Catholic assault. And this is interesting because instead of just denouncing the Catholics, he wrote serious works that said this is what we believe, this is what they teach, this is where they're wrong. It was not a mudslinging contest on his part. He was a serious defender of Armenian Christianity. The wars and disruption of later centuries, together with a gradual loss of interest by the Vatican, slowly weakened this particular Armenian Catholic venture. Reports sent to Rome ceased to be read. Communications with the Vatican grew ever more sporadic. And by the mid-18th century, Catholicism in Armenia had died out. And I'll mention in connection with this a lady I knew in New York who was doing her doctoral dissertation on this particular movement, the Unitarian Brothers in 14th, 15th century Armenia. She worked in the Vatican archives, and she told me that she'd held in her hands the reports sent from Nakhichevan in the 15th, 16th centuries that had never been opened. They put them right on the shelf and forgot about them. Well, you know, this was the time of the Protestant Reformation, and the Vatican had much more to contend with than what was going on in the Middle East, you know. Okay. In the last century of the existence of this Unitarian community, however, the collapse of the Counter-Reformation in Europe and the recognition that Protestantism was not going to be eliminated at any time soon led to a renewal of interest in the re-Catholicizing of the Eastern churches, among them, of course, the Church of Armenia. In the Vatican, histories, dictionaries, and grammars of the Armenian language, together with various liturgical books, were soon being printed, and missionaries of various orders, Jesuits, Franciscans, Dominicans, were dispatched to the Near East with great seriousness of purpose. A Jesuit mission was established at Trebizond in 1685, and another at Erzurum on the Armenian plateau the same year. The great triumph of this movement to re-Catholicize the Armenians was the almost total conversion of the Armenians of Poland to Catholicism in 1649. There were about 200,000 Armenians in Poland. It was a very large and rich community, mostly of merchants, but they've been there for hundreds of years, and a very ambitious local bishop worked to convert them, and he did so successfully. Those who did not go along with the conversion went on to Hungary, where eventually they too were converted to Catholicism. I'll say this about that conversion of these Polish Armenians. Once the conversion took place, the barrier between intermarriage with the Polish population was removed. And intermarriage proceeded rapidly. And there were very few Armenians left, Armenian Catholics left by the 1870s, maybe 10 or 20,000. When the last Armenian Catholic bishop died in 1938, the Vatican saw no need to replace him. There wasn't a community any longer. I myself have met Poles who told me that they were of Armenian background. It was a tradition in their family. One of them was named Vardanovich. In 1742, partly as a result of the activity of the Mekhitarist, the Vatican made a decision to organize a separate Armenian Catholic Church. There is a Greek Catholic Church, and I think there's something like 16 of them, and they are all a part of the Catholic Church. They're allowed to keep their own liturgy, their own vestments, their own language in the Mass, as long as they accept the Pope as the head of the Church and the doctrines of the Catholic Church. The Vatican bends over backwards not to alienate these converts by depriving them of their traditional usages. For example, there was a Roman Catholic bishop who visited an Armenian church in Italy and saw Armenian Catholic Church in Italy and saw statues of Saint Teresa and Saint Francis of Assisi, and he said, no, 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 no. He said, you're supposed to honor your own saints. He said, we have plenty of churches honoring Saint Anthony and Saint Teresa. He said, you honor your own saints and no statues, because he said traditionally the Armenian church does not have statues. So he was insisting that this Latinization of the Armenian Catholic Church be stopped. Okay. Anyway, the headquarters of the new church was set up at a monastery founded on the top of Mount Basmar, overlooking Beirut in Lebanon. Now, if there's anyone in the room from Lebanon has perhaps knows about this monastery, they haven't gone to the mountaintop to see it. You were literally above the clouds. When I went up by bus to visit this monastery, I looked out the window, and to my horror, there were the clouds below us. We were up that high. It's a beautiful monastery with a fine museum, a very handsome museum. And we were taken to the church to see the church, and there were 8 nuns who were saying the rosary at that time. So it was very much a full-fledged institution. On the eve of the genocide, the Armenian Catholic Church consisted of 3 main divisions. There was a patriarch at Basmar, whose jurisdiction came to 12 dioceses. There was an Armenian Catholic vicar at Constantinople, under whom were 11 dioceses. And there was, finally, third, the Armenian Catholic administrator at Tiflis, Tbilisi, in the Russian Empire, under whom came 7 dioceses, with a total of about 150,000 faithful. The Armenian Catholics, however, shared the fate of their apostolic brethren in the years of the genocide, the massacres and deportations of the years 1915 to 22. With the Armenians of Anatolia virtually exterminated, Armenian Catholicism ceased to exist in Turkey beyond Constantinople itself. With its clergy and faithful massacred, its churches destroyed, and its episcopal sees and local parishes wiped out, there was nothing on which you could build anything, rebuild anything. Meanwhile, in the former Russian Empire, then just passing under Soviet rule, the Catholic Church everywhere was suppressed, and the Soviets treated Armenian Catholicism as if it didn't exist. Interestingly, Cardinal Agajanian, who they say was elected Pope, but he refused to take it in 1958, he was a native of Russian Armenia, and he was a product of that Armenian Catholic enterprise in that part of the world. Over the years, a number of small Armenian Catholic parishes emerged in the United States. Originally answering to their local bishop, these parishes were elevated to the rank of a diocese in 1987. When a bishop was appointed over them in Philadelphia, he then moved his headquarters to New York City. Today there are 6 Armenian Catholic parishes in this country: Philadelphia, New York, Chicago, and here in Los Angeles. Since 1979, there has been an Armenian Catholic parish here, and Armenian Catholic nuns are active in Philadelphia, where they have a very, very fine private school, and I understand they have a school here in Los Angeles as well. There's no way telling exactly how many Armenian Catholics exist in this country, or anywhere else for that matter, but they do exist. And recently, those of you who are from Glendale or near Glendale, they built a beautiful church in Glendale, a cathedral for the Armenian Catholics, which honored the 1700th anniversary of the conversion of Armenia to Christianity. Now that brings us to Mekhitar. Supported by the French, Roman Catholic proselytizing was particularly vigorous within the Armenian community in Constantinople and caused much controversy and denominational strife there. The Armenian Patriarch did not hesitate to call in the Sultan to put a stop to this kind of activity. It didn't stop, but there was a good deal of conflict between the Apostolic Church and the Armenian Catholics. It was in this milieu that Mekhitar of Sepastia appeared at the end of the 17th century. His birth name was Manuk, his baptismal name, Manuk. He did not have a last name. He was Manuk Vordi Bedrossi, Manuk, the son of Peter. And he took the name Mekhitar, which means consoler, as his religious name. He was born in 1676. He was a precocious child who could learn to read at the age of 5. He became a deacon when he was 14, and he became a vartapet at the age of 20. And at that age, he was converted to Catholicism while on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, where in 1796 he was ordained a priest. Mekhitar is an interesting individual. We've had him before in Armenian history. He was desperate for an education, a good education, the best education he could get. And he left Sepastia when he was a young man and went to Echmiadzin. And again, this is in the period of Armenian decadence. He couldn't find what he was looking for at Echmiadzin. He went to a couple of other monasteries in Armenia that had been famed for their learning, but he found that this was no longer true. So he was on his way to Jerusalem when he met up with Armenian Catholics. He'd been exposed to them before and converted to Catholicism. He did go to Constantinople, and he tried to get the Patriarch to see his goal, which was to uplift the Armenian people through education. And the Patriarch Abadid was not interested in this. He said, this is the Catholics trying to worm their way in. So Mekhitar was persecuted. He gathered a group of like-minded followers and left Turkey. He went to southern Greece, which at that time was under Venetian rule. And there he was given land to set up a monastery. However, the Turks came in and conquered that area, and the Venetians had to leave, and Mekhitar went with them, with his followers. He went to Venice, took refuge there. There, in the year 1717, the reigning duke, what they call in Venice the Doge, the reigning duke, gave them the deserted island of San Lazzaro in the Venetian lagoon. This had been the leper colony for the city, but the last lepers had died, and the hospital was abandoned, and so was the church. So the Doge said, you can have this island, and he deeded it to the Armenian people in perpetuity with the order, the Mekhitar's order, as the trustees. So they managed the island for the Armenian people. And I remember once when I first went to visit San Lazzaro, there was an American Armenian there with his wife, and we were taken all over, the three of us were taken all over, and after he'd seen everything, he said to the monk that showed us around, he said, "To hell with Soviet Armenia, this is Armenia." And he wrote out a check for $50,000 around there, you know. There, in a setting of great beauty and peace, Mekhitar devoted the rest of his life to the fulfillment of his dream. In establishing his order, Mekhitar chose as his guiding force the Benedictine rule. You know, in the Armenian Church, there's only the one order of monks, but in the Catholic Church, there are many different orders. And Mekhitar could choose from any of them. He chose the Benedictine rule because it was based on a three-part foundation of work, study, and prayer. Now, Benedict lived in the 6th century, and this was more than 1,000 years later, but Mekhitar said, this is what we need, for a very interesting reason. In the days under Muslim rule, 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, there was great decadence in the monasteries. Monks would go into the monasteries with the idea, or supposedly, of praying, and they didn't do anything else. They lived off their peasants who raised food and supplied them with what they needed. And some of the monasteries were very decadent. You know, it was not unusual to find a monk drunk on a feast day. The Russian monasteries were the same way. And Mekhitar didn't want this. He said, we have to have something that is responsible to the Armenian people. And he chose the idea of work, study, and prayer. Why did prayer come last for St. Benedict? Because he said a monastery is not a place for goof-offs, in so many words. He said the monastery is not a place for shirkers. It is a place where you should have some occupation. You should be working and able to work and willing to work. And second of all, a monastery is not a place to put your retarded son, you know. A monastery is a place where there should be intellectual activity. Now, if you show us you can work, and you show us that you can study, you can think, you can learn, then you come in and you can pray, you see. So that was Benedict's idea, and Mekhitar adopted it. His program was designed to achieve 4 goals. First, the unification of the Armenian Church to that of Rome. That was kept on a back burner. 2, the expansion of educational opportunities for Armenian youth. That was put forward. 3, the introduction of Western learning to the Armenian people. Remember, this is the 18th century now. This is the age of Enlightenment. And a great deal of exciting work was being done intellectually in Europe, in the West. And Mekhitar wanted to introduce this to the Armenian people. And 4th, he wanted to introduce Armenian culture to people in the West. Because, you know, we're not just a bunch, I'm going to use a modern term, we're not just a bunch of ragheads out there. We have achieved great things. He said, we want you to know about this. So those were his 4 projects. The reason why he didn't push the unification of the Armenian Church to the Catholic Church in the forefront was because he didn't want to alienate people. You know, he didn't want to alienate. He wanted to attract people by saying, come to our monastery, we're going to give you modern learning. You know. To these 3 ends, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th, Mekhitar founded a school, established a printing press, and published either Armenian books, books either translated from Armenian to Western languages or from Western languages into Armenian. Mekhitar himself translated the entire Bible into Armenian. He was not happy with the Bible as it existed, and he thought it needed a new version. He also translated a very important medieval Christian work, The Imitation of Christ by Thomas à Kempis. He translated that as well. With these translations, Mekhitar began that series of translations of great books, which continued unceasingly during the next 2 centuries, ranging from works by the early fathers of the Church, the works of St. Thomas Aquinas, and also the works of Homer and Virgil, and the better historians and poets of the modern world. Word of his activities spread, and 2 wealthy Armenians of India, Murat and Raphael, contributed a large sum of money, they were rich merchants, to the establishment of an Armenian college in Venice. Now, it wasn't really what we would call a college today. It was really a prep school. It would prepare young Armenian men to go into the European universities. And with the money that they received from these two merchants, the Mekhitarist bought a palace in Venice, and there they established the school. I saw it. It was a proper palace, marble floors, marble column, beautiful place. But unfortunately, it has recently been closed. In 1810, the policies of Napoleon in Italy forced this offshoot to transfer its activities to Vienna, where it remains to this day. You know, San Lazzaro is a beautiful island with a monastery and a church on it. The one in Vienna is nowhere near as attractive. It's a huge building, about 5 stories high. It occupies an entire city block with a big courtyard in the center, but it's large and commodious, and much serious work has been done there. Well, in 1810, as I said, Napoleon gave orders to close all the monasteries in Italy, but he specifically allowed the Mekhitarist to continue their work on the grounds that this was an educational institution, not a religious one, primarily an educational institution. I've never seen it in print, I heard that Napoleon's wife, the Empress Josephine, had something to do with it. She visited the monastery, was deeply impressed by what the monks were doing, and told Napoleon, don't close them down. Thus the two Mekhitarist centers continued, one in Venice, specializing in historical and literary work, and the one in Vienna, devoted more to linguistics and philosophy, but both engaged in an active program of teaching, publication, and the collection of manuscripts and printed books. The Venetian house supported itself by developing the art of deluxe book printing, and for decades it was a publisher of choice for art books and other fine publication in Italy. The Viennese Mekhitarist, on their part, became the government printing office for the Austrian Empire. That's how they paid the bills. During the first century after its foundation, the Mekhitarist order provided the only major focus for Armenian culture in the world. And for 100 years, the Armenian people had little else in the way of intellectual life. That's not my opinion, this is what I've read, and read it from apostolic writers. Those of you who know of the scholar and author Vahi Oshagan, he insisted on this very strongly, that he said we had nothing else for 100 years. The 18th century may be called the age of the Mekhitarist. It was the Armenian response to the age of enlightenment. Thereafter, in the 19th century, a genuine Armenian Renaissance developed. The monks of both Mekhitarist houses extended their work, producing major publications, establishing a network of schools, and gathering the 2 largest collections of Armenian manuscripts outside of the Middle East. The journal Pasmavet, published in Venice since 1843, and Handes on Sodia, published since 1887 in Vienna, were the vehicles for Mekhitarist research and thought, and they remain 2 of the oldest learned publications in Europe. One of the first major works to come out of the Mekhitarist in Venice was the famed classical Armenian dictionary Nor Baharan Hakazian Lesbi. And you have it here, excuse me, you have it here in your library, right here. This is the re-edition, it's not the original. The original was 4 volumes. This has been reprinted in 2. When the reprint was published in Venice about 1970, they wanted $1,000 for these. I picked it up at the flea market in Yerevan for 12. It is a dictionary of classical Armenian, classical Greek, and Latin. every word, they use the Armenian Bible as a source for the vocabulary. Every verb, every word is included, and the translation is given in Greek and Latin. There's a definition in Armenian, the rest is in Greek and Latin. The work of the 19th century scholars in Venice and Vienna marked the beginning of Armenian studies as we know them today. And they formed the foundation for the work that was launched in other centers in Western Europe and in Armenia itself only after the coming of the Soviets. One of the things that attracted European scholars to the Mekhitaris was the discovery, yes? Oh, thank you, Barbara. Was the discovery of a work in Armenian, a translation of something by Saint Irenaeus. Saint Irenaeus lived in the 2nd century. We have many of his works, others have been lost. A lost work of Saint Irenaeus was discovered in the manuscripts in Venice. Saint Irenaeus was a disciple of the Apostle John. So he worked and studied under a man who had worked with Jesus Christ. So anything he wrote is, of course, of great significance. And here this manuscript was found in Venice of a work, a long-lost work by Irenaeus. That attracted a lot of attention. And European scholars said, what else have these people got? You know, and there was a great deal of interest in Armenian works. Among the lost works discovered, 13 letters by St. Ignatius of Antioch, the works of St. Ephraim the Syrian, which are written in Syriac, but there's an Armenian translation of most of them in Venice, a harmony of the Gospels, and an edition of the history of the Church by Eusebius, which is quite different from the one we already had. So these are things that, attracted a lot of attention. Foremost among Mekhitar's pupils was Father Michael Chamchan, author of a history of Armenia. Although based upon national and foreign sources, it's been criticized. It's not a modern work. It was published in 1787, and its importance is it was the first Armenian history written to be printed on a printing press, rather than copied by hand. All earlier Armenian histories were manuscript histories, but the history by Chamchan was written to be printed by press. It was not, as I say, a serious work by modern standards, but it has been reprinted, and you can get it today. It took him 5 years to write it. What he did was, he lined up all the Armenian historians, starting from the very earliest, Agatongos, and going right down to his own time, and wove them all together. He just wove them into one long narrative in several volumes. And then he added what he could find in Greek and Roman historians and other travelers' works. And that's the way he put it together. He was not critical. He mixed the good, the bad, and the indifferent. But it was something that had never been done before. And the Armenians, for the first time in the history of their own country, which they could hold in their hands. That had not existed before. There were individual histories, but there were no entire histories of Armenia. And there was Lucas Injinjan, who wrote a geography of Armenia. He took an old medieval geography and said, I can do better than this. And he updated it, and he wrote a description of Armenia, which was a very important work when it came out in 1822. And there was Kevork Avatikian, who produced the great dictionary of the Armenian language I just showed you, along with 2 of the monks who accompanied him on the project. He was also the translator, there was Arsène Bagratuni, who was a translator of Homer, Virgil, the French playwright Racine, the French thinker Voltaire, and the Italian author Alfieri, and Bishop Edward Hermuz, poet and translator of Virgil's Aeneid, and Father Termalian, who also translated the Iliad and the Odyssey. Okay. Well, I should mention Father Zarbanalian, who wrote the first history of Armenian literature and the first history of Armenian printing. Another deacon who I mentioned, he was also wrote the first study of Armenian hymns, hymnography. Another very important scholar, born in 1820, he lived to 1901, Levant Alishan, perhaps one of the most widely read and highly respected scholars produced in Venice. He wrote a number, he wrote 100 books. He wrote at least 100 books. And one of them I brought with me to show you. This is typical of the type of thing the Mekhitarist published, and this is typical of the type of thing that Alishan wrote. This is a book entitled Sisakan. It is a geographical description of what is now the southern part of the Armenian Republic, Zangezur. And this has close to 600 pages. And that's the sort of thing that Alishan devoted himself to. He was a great scholar. These works, philological, geographical, and historical, have a decidedly poetical cast. In fact, Alishan's rightful place in literature could just as easily be among poets as scholars. The Vienna Mekhitarist, they produced people like Hewsen who died in 1902. He wrote the first critical grammar of the classical Armenian language. And Garadin Kalempiarian, who died in 1917, wrote the first history of Armenian journalism. So they were plugging up a lot of gaps in our knowledge of the Armenian past and literature. Another star in the Vienna group was Reverend Hakkab Dashjan, a first-rate scholar. He went through all the Armenian historical works, picking out the names of monasteries. And then what he did, he published a series of books, one on each province, showing what the monasteries were there, and if there was anything that was known about them, he would include it. It stopped short of being an encyclopedia of Armenian monasteries, but it's more than a catalog. And he discovered there were about 2,500 Armenian monasteries founded over the centuries, most of which no longer exist today. So. The reason why so many of these works were published so quickly is that there was a monk at Venice, Haruchun Afgharian, who died in 1855. He was Lord Byron's tutor in Armenian. I'll return to that in a moment. And he translated Milton's Paradise Lost into Armenian, a gigantic project, and translated several German works into Armenian. Now, I mentioned Lord Byron, the great English poet. He visited the monastery, and in just about the last year of his life, he spent several weeks there and learning the Armenian language. He said he needed something to work his mind on. He said, this is the toughest thing I can find. He left his exercises behind, and he did some translating. He left that all behind when he left, and they're still in the possession of the Mekhitarists, who are very, very proud of Lord Byron's stay, and they sort of don't let you forget it. According to Lord Byron, when he visited the monastery, there were 40 fathers, 18 pupils, and 8 men operating the printing press. And that's a very interesting thing about the Mekhitarist press. Everything, of course, is published in Armenian for the most part. So they have to have workmen, printers, who know the language. So what they do when someone dies, they advertised in the paper for someone who would like to work in the Armenian press on San Lazzaro, and the proviso is you've got to learn Armenian. And in the days, when there was a lot of unemployment in Italy, there were young men who cheerfully came to the island and said, I'll give it a try. And they learned Armenian in order to do the work. In the light of this work, the 19th century Armenian Renaissance becomes incomprehensible unless you understand what the Mekhitarist did in the way of Armenian culture. Their major achievements had a great impact on what was going on outside of their island, outside of Vienna. The birth of the Armenian Renaissance, Constantinople, in Venice, and then in Padua and Paris, where they had other schools. They collected manuscripts. This was very important. There's no time to go into detail, but in 1795, the Persians invaded Armenia. One monastery gathered all the manuscripts they could in one place for security, and the Persians captured the monastery and set it afire. 25,000 Armenian manuscripts were lost. So the Mekhitarists realized the importance of getting manuscripts out of danger. And so, particularly after 1895, after the massacres of 1895, they sent agents, monks, to go into Turkey and buy up whatever you can get. And they would go from monastery to monastery and say, do you have any books you'd like to sell? Many of the monks had no idea the value of what they had. And they said, take, And there's one European traveler who spent the night in an Armenian monastery in the 19th century, and he said, do you have any manuscripts by any chance? They said, in there. So he went into this room, no windows, moist walls, the manuscripts piled on the floor, on top of one another, eaten by worms, and he said, well, what are these? What are these books? There's church books. They didn't know what they had. Yeah. It wasn't just the Armenian monasteries like that. You had the same thing in Greece, and you had the same thing at Mount Sinai, where there was a monk keeping himself warm by tearing pages out of a manuscript and sticking them in a fire. And this Englishman said, he saw another one like that. May I have this? He said, take it, take it. It turned out to be the oldest copy of the Bible in existence. It's in the British Museum. That's the sort of thing that, Well, the Mekhitarists were aware of this. They were Europeanized. They had a regularly organized library. They said, get these things and bring them here. And gradually, they built up a collection. Now, they did this in Jerusalem, too. The early Apostolic Church knew what was going on. The monastery in Jerusalem has about 4,000 Armenian manuscripts. Venice has about 3,000. Vienna, about 2,500. And that's the largest, these are the largest collections. They're more numerous than what they had at the Montanadaran in Yerevan. The Montanadaran has 11,000 Armenian manuscripts, but between Jerusalem, Venice, Vienna, Oxford, which has 600, there are more Armenian manuscripts outside of Armenia than inside. They also collected things like Armenian coins, carpets, masterpieces of church art, censers, Armenian costumes, Armenian silverwork, whatever they could lay their hands on. And of course, they built up a library of more than 10,000 books in other languages besides Armenians. Monks with artistic talent began to engrave Armenian maps, Armenian medallions, I own several, to illustrate books with etchings, publish works of art, publish pictures of Armenian historical places and monuments in order to revive the love of the Armenian land and the Armenian culture of the people. The Armenian theatrical movement started also to spread abroad in the 19th century because the Mekhitarists organized plays in performances of plays in their Armenian schools. The communization of Eastern Europe after World War II resulted in the suppression of Roman Catholicism there, as well as in the Soviet Union, and the closing all the Mekhitarist schools and the confiscation of Mekhitarist assets. The last was had a particularly hard effect on the Viennese Mekhitarists because they owned extensive property in Hungary, all of which was converted to take it away from them and held by the authorities. A few decades later, ruinous investments resulted in the almost complete destitution of the order in Venice. I don't know the details, to be honest, where they would take too long to go into them. I do know that a con man went in, told the abbot, I can double your money, like that. And he mortgaged everything they had and gave the money to this man. It turned out to be a crook. And the monastery was bereft. And of course they notified the Vatican, and the Vatican said, look, don't ask us for money, it's your problem. But, the monastery fell on very hard times. Last time I was there, it was quite shabby. However, some well-to-do Armenian islands came to the rescue, and now the monastery is once again on a firm footing. At one time they were down to 2 monks. Now they have about 5 or 6 monks. So it's been a hard time. The loss also of so many faithful in the genocide resulted in an increased difficulty in recruiting new monks, and changing times have affected the recruitment as well. It's hard to get young men and women to give up marriage and everything that goes with it to be a priest. It has a problem here for the Catholic Church in the United States. So there's been little research or application in the grand manner since 1945, and as I said, the Lazarian College was closed by the end of the 20th century. Well, that's the bad news. Now there's good news. Since the fall of the Soviet Union and the resulting emergence of an independent Armenian Republic, religious freedom has been restored, and the Armenian Catholic Church has moved swiftly to reach out to whatever remnants of the Armenian Catholic faithful that have survived in Armenia, and to reestablish itself as a religious force on the Armenian scene. Although this aggressive activity has caused some resentment in the Armenian Apostolic Church, and the matter has been taken up by the Vatican, this must be measured against the otherwise excellent relations that have been established and maintained between the Catholicos of Echmiadzin and the papacy. A feeling of mutual respect that culminated in 2001 in the unprecedented visit of the clearly dying Pope John Paul II to Armenia to take part in the commemoration of the 1700th anniversary of the conversion of the country to Christianity. He also presided at the consecration of the new cathedral in Yerevan. That did not get the publicity it should have gotten. In prior centuries, the Armenian church has been regarded as a church that no Catholic was supposed to go into. It was a church in heresy. This demonstrated that was no longer the case. As far as the Roman Catholic Church is concerned, the Armenian Apostolic Church is a church in good standing, and any Catholic who finds himself where there's no Catholic Church and there is an Armenian church is free to attend. In 2000, the breach between the Venetian and Viennese Mekhitarist communities was healed, and the 2 monasteries entered the new millennium as 2 establishments of the same order. Though its existence has resulted in considerable dissension and dispute within the Armenian community over the past 300 years, the Armenian Catholic Church has been a fully participating entity in Armenian life, learning, and education ever since the arrival of Mekhitar of Sepastia to Venice in 1717. The Mekhitarists have rendered inestimable benefits to the Armenian people since that time, and they deserve the recognition that they have earned. Thank you.